Everything flows. The weather has changed. In Nietzsche's Will to Power notebooks, Nietzsche regards with awe the strange consistency and character of art that its iterative function is to universally affirm life. Art uplifts with respect to the elements of existing, especially those deemed unpleasant, unbecoming, insofar as the overarching goal of art as human practice is to ensure that we may not perish by the truth. Art performs this daunting task by both distracting from and illuminating the existential situation of humankind, and behaves for beings of our ilk akin to a life preserver for the mind, its role serving a deep biological function for our burgeoning species. The dawn of consciousness in humankind provided more needs for our type of being. No longer would we simply be required to find sustenance for the body. Now we require it for the mind as well. The dawn of the effects of this new necessity are observable when one considers the nature and genesis of Greek drama and theater, where groups would gather together to observe a tragedy, an unavoidable twist of nature at the hands of the fates, while the chorus, acting as a voice of the community, comments on said actions. The idea was this: humans are not in control of what happens on earth. Bad things happen to good people. There seems to be no rhyme or reason to the doling out of blessings and curses at the hands of the universe. So how do we, conscious beings, continue to persevere, psychologically, knowing the absurd truth that our feelings about the world have no relationship to the events which occur within it? How do we set our mind to the task of living when we understand existence to be fraught with peril, inevitable hardships, and ultimately death? How, you ask? We affirm those things which are unavoidable, which are inevitable, and instead of drawing a circle around only those elements of being we wish to praise, we instead raise these necessary yet unpleasant facets of being, the meaninglessness, the death, the toil, the struggle, the cruelty, to the level of worship. Great theater, at least as it was first conceived, raised the worst that a human being could experience to the level of worship, to say, life, even in spite of all this, is good. It provided one with the means to say yes to life itself, by considering existence under the aspect of eternity as a bystander, when from the position of one mortal being, there are oftentimes so many reasons to say no. Western theater, if considered on a continuum from the form of Greek tragedy on through to no change in the weather, has altered course radically. This dramatic shift in tone and purpose reflects a change in the psychological needs of the communities who produced these works. The feeling for Greek tragedy has been lost. The kind of thinking, the type of thought, the kind of people who produced it, long gone, lost to modernity. The idea of fate, so far gone that the insinuation that human beings are not in complete control of the events which occur on earth is bewildering to the modern thinker. We are a people who live constantly in the shadow of the death of God, the idea of gods themselves, the shadow of fate incarnate, the shadow of the impossibility of human agency. We have instead psychologically transferred the role of agency from our mystical projection of the universe as God, and indeed, how do you blame the universe for its machinations, to the mistaken impression of cause and effect, and the resultant conclusion that if there is a cause and effect, that human beings certainly must be the cause. This naive modern conception of the triumph of human reason, the Holocaust, Rwanda, the gulags, swept under the rug in order to circle this worldview, has landed at the all-too-modern, all-too-human notion that humans are responsible for the events on earth, a kind of narcissism. This belief is grounded on the assumption that consciousness is some freestanding structure, as if it were cause and effect itself, and not simply the last addendum to a creature already formed, a creature whose passions dictate their reason, and thus the beautiful existential medium of theater, which was used in ancient times to affirm existence by accepting that one cannot effectively, pragmatically, or usefully blame the cage, nature, or the cage maker the idea of a god for one's woes, since one can raise their fists against those elements all one desires, and neither will reply, not ever, no matter how hard one screams, has unfortunately for humankind, and at the expense of hundreds of millions of lives, been transmuted under the idea that one can blame human beings mistakenly and make them pay, as it were, for the existential state of the world. We cannot shake the cage or the cage maker, but we can certainly shake each other. The Tutsi are the source of our existential miseries, cried the Hutus. The Jews are the source of our existential miseries, cried the Germans. The bourgeois are the source of our existential miseries, cried the communists. White males are the source of our existential miseries, cried the postmodern feminists. The politicians are the source of our existential miseries, cries no change in the weather. Each of these psychological projections of causal relationships belie the horrifying reality that perhaps no person, no group has their hand on the tiller and misses entirely the original intended purpose of tragedy theater, existential relief for a problem to which there is no solution. Activism was not the intended purpose of ancient theater. Existential relief was. One did not see a Greek tragedy, so one could, at its close, go join the movement, as it were. This would make no sense to a people of that era. The function of the play was complete at the show's conclusion. Today, however, theater is employed psychologically by humans and their modern conceptions towards activism, built on the insinuation that there is some existential problem and something both can and should be done to assuage it. In No Change in the Weather, the character Faith asks, "How do you solve a problem like Newfoundland?" In an interview posted on the Facebook group for the musical, the actress who portrays Ruth, Brooke Adams, is quoted, "I don't really pay attention to politics, which the show has actually made me realize that I should, because now that I know how much it's affected our province, I realize how big of a deal it is, and that we should have more youth involved in advocating for stuff." The poster for the play displays in a bold font 6 words, and I quote, "See the musical, make the difference." This musical is offering, alongside relief, a task? What difference would they like the audience to make? What is the concern at hand? Paul Rowe, who plays the character James, in the same interview with CTV notes, "In our current reality, we are in a situation where we're more or less going to go off a fiscal cliff in a couple of years, and so we're confronting some really serious financial matters at home. Ah, and it is revealed, the moral germ, the seed from which the entire plant has grown, money, resources. CTV News observes how No Change in the Weather achieves its political ends as it takes, quote, some of the most famous songs from the province and combines them with a story that sheds light on the challenges people have faced there. Music plays the largest role in shaping the production. In fact, the title of the musical itself is taken from a line in a well-known diasporic anthem, No Change in Me, which, if considered in the context of Greek tragic art, is much closer to the heart of the initial function of tragedy than the musical which bears its name, as it points no fingers and rallies no troops, yet uplifts in respect to the existential nature of the crisis facing Newfoundlanders. In brief, the song describes how the main streets and the coast are so empty one could fire a cannon down them, that the opportunities once flourishing in this place a people call home have all but vanished, that regular individuals do not simply want to pick up and leave, homesick, being sore you left with no choice but to leave. The song puts an anthem to a new diaspora as the protagonist joins in the leaving like all the rest, Montreal, Calgary, Vancouver, West. Gorgeous chorus captures perhaps one of the most touching points of view regarding the tragedy befalling the people of Newfoundland in the wake of the collapse of the cod fishing industries. I don't want to leave, but I can't live for free. Can't eat the air, can't drink the sea. No change in the weather, no change in me. Ah, no change in me, the age-old conundrum. We simultaneously are and are not the same person we were 10, 20 years ago. There is both a change and a consistency, yet, while the world rapidly swirls around us, I am still I. caught up in the tumult of the absolute fabric of reality, endless, ceaseless change. Life is change. Everything flows. Noteworthy, aside from the lyrical content of this beautiful tune, the melodies, the chord changes, reveal something quite interesting about the nature of the diasporic feeling. That this music, these structures, these songs, this culture, which is so proudly Newfoundland, their identity, is itself the resultant diasporic product of the Irish and Celtic groups who previously fled economic and resource collapse elsewhere. The people of Newfoundland, currently entering a new period of diasporic despair, are themselves already a product of diasporic despair. In fact, if one follows this trail back to its logical conclusions, it becomes apparent that the humans who colonized Ireland were themselves diaspora from somewhere else, all the way back to Africa, all the way back to eternity. The idea of a diaspora assumes in itself beginnings and ends. No change in the weather assumes that Newfoundland was a beginning, and this modern cod-fishing diaspora is the end, when in fact Newfoundland itself was the end of another diaspora. And just as the play attempts to say this is the end of one way of life due to the nature of life itself, the end of one way of life, although undeniably tragic, is the beginning of another. Fate closes a door and opens a window. If considered on a long enough timeline, in fact, no group is from some one place. We are constantly being displaced by the nature of reality, the requirement for resources with which to nourish our subsequent generations. The nature of the diasporic feeling is that it is the fabric of being, the fabric of existence itself. We must constantly move to greener pastures. Everything flows. This kind of musical, instead of facing up to the reality of the existential crisis, cod fishing was a green pasture which has gone dry. Tragically, and one must strap up one's boots and either produce an entirely novel and prosperous industry in the same location, or, alternatively, move to where one can flourish. Rather, this musical attempts to point to a supposed agency, to blame a group, in this case, the realm of politics and politicians, for spoiling the grass. Coal miners want to mine coal forever. Car makers want to make cars forever. Observe the current GM strike. Cod fishers want to fish forever because doing what one knows, what one has done, is safe, and eventually, after enough successive generations, one believes they are owed this way of life. Without realizing, all ways of life are blessing baskets from the universe, which, in the style of Greek tragedy, have been altered dramatically. Although human beings no longer believe in fate, fate still believes in us, whether we like it or not. The world has changed, and one must change around it. I fear no change in the weather, although riddled with beautiful tunes and the soulful culture of a lovely people, a people I am incredibly sympathetic towards, has lost the feeling of the titular tune used to frame it. The harsh reality that there is no going back, we cannot return to where we once started, like a Tolkien narrative, also built on Celtic culture. When the hobbits return to the Shire, their home is no longer the same, and they themselves are no longer the same. Diaspora is the nature of being. Ways of life become untenable. New cities, new peoples, constructed. There certainly has been a change in the weather, and I believe it would be in the best interest of the wonderful inhabitants of Newfoundland to look deep into their hearts at the toughness, the hardiness which got them to Ireland, from Africa, from Ireland, to their Canadian coastal home, and summon the courage, the resilience, to accept there must be a change in them if they are to prosper, to flourish, for future generations. Salah, my brothers and sisters, Salah, from one diasporic community to another, you will persevere, provided the understanding that the path is not and cannot ever be political. It is and will always be personal.